I know that this was a long time coming, and I finished this book a while ago and had yet to, review it. The worst part about it is that I wrote this review at pretty much the end of 2020, and just because of all the things going on in my life, just a bunch of bullshit emotionally and physically, I just never got around to recording very much, and so anyway, intro aside, I'm gonna just get to the damn point. And I know that a lot of you are curious about my opinion on this book, so this is what I have to say about it. Here's my review of Reflection, which was written by Lynette Fromey. I actually came across Lynette's book from another person on YouTube, Stoner Van Houten, who had also reviewed the book. I knew that the book had less to do with the murders and more about her time with Charlie. Beyond that, I read the book going in blind. In other words, I hadn't seen anything inside it before. Going into the book, I felt like it immediately had a ton of imagery, with Lynette's words feeling soft and flowy like a stream of clear water. Overall, the book seems to excel in imagery, with the pictures she depicted appearing simply, like the reader was viewing it themselves. In contrast to this, these in-depth descriptions seemed superfluous at times, where they could do more harm than good. Sometimes it was rather painful trying to get to the next section of the book, as it felt like some parts chugged along due to the details given or the context they were supposed to provide. This in itself doesn't make it a bad book, though it created problems in pacing, at least for me as a reader, where I felt like we were basically doing stop, go, stop, go. I did like the history lessons on California and some of the places that they went to early in the book. It came off as intelligent and interesting, though I did wonder what was the exact point of these. Especially how later in the book, these lessons just abruptly stopped. Now, in the time that I've read this book and even written this book review, I listened to the interview that Stoner Van Houten did with Lynette Fromey, and I know that she said that, she felt like these history lessons were just interesting, and everybody should know this. And knowing that, that's perfectly fine. But once again, I do wonder, what happened? Why did they just stop? The lack of a full-out point or typical theme in the book isn't necessarily a bad thing, though most novels in the 300 to 400 page range conform to a clear start, middle, and end. Usually at some point, there is a clear climax to the whole story where the arch has built up and we, the reader, see some sort of pay through. Reflection, unfortunately, does not do this, though it's not really surprising. Considering the content of the book and its overall writing style, it really doesn't make sense that Lynette's book would conform to a conventional style. I understand that with a story about real life, we wouldn't have these clear arches and story tropes, but a similar style is applied, though, in nonfiction books. One of my favorite books, for example, is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. The book talks about his father's time in Poland right before and during Poland in World War II, then his imprisonment in Auschwitz. This was a true story, but there was still a clear timeline structure that the graphic novel followed. Reflection's nonconformity is a detriment in some ways, as there are no clear-cut chapters and nothing just flat out says, Chapter 1. This may not be so bad in its physical form, but digitally, which is the version that I read, it became a bit confusing. I could tell that this confused many people of my audience also, as I have gotten or had gotten a lot of comments asking if what they were listening to was in chronological order, at least in the order of the book. The first few titles of the beginning chapters jumped around in time, which caused people to think that they had missed something. This actually confused me too, and reading the book to myself, I had to go back and forth a few times in the beginning chapters to go back and forth between a year in the first and second chapters. It might have stylistically looked nice, but was confusing for readers, especially those listening. I wonder if maybe this confusion is there or not. I wonder if it's like this when looking at the physical edition of the book, though I imagine probably not. Since, of course, when you have the physical book, you can flip the pages and, you can feel where you're at. On top of that, I think I wrote it later in my review, but, I just want to say it now. I know that some of the things that I might end up complaining about, the confusion part, some of this stuff probably wasn't intended to happen, it wouldn't happen, wasn't intended to happen, because I don't think they ever anticipated someone actually wanting to read the book out loud, for someone to do what I just did. And that's fine, that's okay. But there are still some stylistic issues that just made me scratch my head more than anything. Having a digital copy of having a digital copy of the book, I don't believe it was intended to be the confusing read. And like I said, I do wonder also if the transcription of the book to computer might have gotten botched a little bit. I can definitely tell that reading the digital version, it seems like this was definitely intended as a physical book. I noticed grammatical errors, though there were a few, spelling errors and a couple of typos. But what I found really off, though, were some of the sentence placements that were pretty odd. And the words, to me, there were words that didn't contextually fit. Contextually. Anyway. But these errors were not nearly as bad as Susan Atkins's second book. But I did have to pause from recording at various moments to just understand what statements we're getting at. Sometimes it just didn't make sense. I felt troubled because I still never know, or I felt troubled because I still don't know with me doing this if I should ever read a book verbatim, errors and all, or if I should just fix things in passing as I read along. Honestly, a lot of that is the reason why you might even hear some of the errors that I keep in a book, because I'm like, I don't know, But if I have to pause while recording, I usually just decide to read it verbatim so that the listeners can just make the opinions for themselves. Kind of like Susan Atkins' second book, it is ultimately not up to me to fix errors from the writers. And I'm not saying that passive-aggressively. I just, I'm like, okay, if I stop and edit what the book says to say it correctly myself, I end up just becoming a second editor at that point. But anyway, I feel like the story, though, was interesting overall and a true reflection from parts of Fromey's life. The book is more like an undated diary than the typically written novel, as written by her peers. Diane Lake's book, in contrast, has a more linear point of which we can accurately measure the end. Now, how the book ended has led people to criticize Diane Lake's book. But in that novel, it was depicted like a narrative, where Lynette's book is more about reminiscing. A clear difference in Lynette's book than the others was the happier tone she had about Charlie, where everyone else brought up points just really to criticize him. Going through the book, I noticed that there was virtually nothing on violence. Every other book has made the mention of Charlie's quick temper and how he would hit women. And Paul mentioned in his book how Charlie had hit Sadie, I believe, when she was pregnant. Diane's book is rife with Charlie's abuse. And even Tex Watson felt bad for Diane Lake. Yet, the book from Lynette herself makes no mention of this. No hair pulling, no name calling, no smacks in the mouth. I think there might have been like a part where he pulled Nancy's hair, but that was pretty much it. But I can't help but wonder, why is that? Was this a safe choice, purposely omitting such information to make Charlie seem like he wasn't bad? Or in her life story and life experience, did Charlie never hit anybody? The most that was really brought up was how Charlie and Mary would get into fights, sometimes like when she was pregnant, and how he hit Gypsy. I liked the information that Lynette divulged that wasn't talked about in the other books. I had no idea that she had ever even gotten pregnant and later had a miscarriage from Charlie. Though the recurrent theme of Charlie trying to get other women pregnant and women wanting to have his babies was kind of a bit much sometimes. Was he trying to populate the earth with his seed, like it was so implied in Helter Skelter? Or did Charlie just simply have a pregnancy fetish? His first night with Sandra Good read more like a kinky sex scene from a sperm bank novel than the eye-opening experience than that I think it was supposed to be. I give a lot of credit to Sandra, though. Honestly, I mean it. And that her writing at parts of the story was really good. And that's something for me that I read. Now, I know that the parts that Sandra had read and I was speaking doesn't translate, at least to the audio version of all of this. I could easily see Sandra writing a book of her own, as her snippets in Lynette's story flowed really well and were easy to read. The imagery there was great too. Sandy's excerpt from where she first met the group really showed, in conjunction with other or various parts of Lynette's book, that history repeats itself and some things never change. The talk of illegal abortions was pretty relevant to my time of reading this book in 2022, where Roe versus Wade was overturned. Even before that part of the book, I couldn't help but laugh at how the female political activists Lynette described at Berkeley were just the same as the social justice warriors of today. The line of how they used the word oppression to show that they too were enslaved. That was just perfect. A clear indicator that history repeats itself and the white savior mentality has never left. Perhaps she wrote that on purpose to show the comparison of the two today. And even if this is not so, it really was a line that resonated with me. Having grown tired of the white knights myself, it's points like that that show how good the book could be at times, making comparisons and showing relevancy to the modern day. There seems to be a real naive mentality to Lynette, at least as her younger self. It should be expected, though, since she was only 19 by the end of the story, I believe. Well, the end of chapter 12. It seemed that 19-year-old Lynette was easily influenced by everything Charlie said. Perhaps it's because I was not the intended demographic that Charlie was looking for, but I constantly thought to myself, reading the book, how could somebody easily believe everything he said? It was a bit bothersome to read Lynette taking everything that Charlie said as fact. I feel like it was easy to see Charlie saying things that could manipulate naive young people. Considering how Lynette's upbringing was a sheltered, high middle class one, she had probably been predisposed to believe everything from someone like Charlie, because in some ways she just didn't know better. She just didn't have the life experience to see when a con was using her to get what he wanted. Though it seems like once she did get a hint of this, she seemed to not really care. In her eyes, Charlie was the most amazing person she ever met. And a majority, if really not all of her story, was just good times, happy memories, and the occasional moodiness from Charlie. The rather worrying point I had seen was how Lynn, and no one else in the story, seemed to care about the growing number of minors that got with the group. The fact that the story talked about them being more annoyed with the cops for trying to bust the minors than telling them to go away was just weird to me. I know that some of those minors were close to legal age, like Ruth Ann, but still, it just seemed wrong. And honestly, a lot more trouble than it was worth. Granted, people like Diane Lake had nowhere else to go. But the constant hiding from the cops that Nancy did would have been averted if they just told her to go home. Instead, no one seemed to care that there were minors doing illegal things, having sex with men twice their age. Lynn's book didn't talk about the sexual experience, though, that Diane Lake allegedly received in her book. Interestingly, there were reflections about Patricia enjoying her time with the group and even almost dying in a car crash in Alabama. Lynn wondered if Patricia had died in Alabama, would Abigail Folger still be alive today? While these are great questions, I don't understand why other matters discussed outside of this book were ignored. Random parts and paragraphs were repeated, like the story of the dying cancerous police officer on page 299. Again, it appears on page 309 with the anecdote about Brenda from Sandy. I thought that I was going nuts when I first read this, but checking through the book, the repeats were really there. The police officer is mentioned on page 294, then not long after on page 299, as stated before. Then I guess apparently 309, as I wrote in this review. Anyway, this is all in the same chapter and barely 5 pages apart. It's just a clear copy-paste with no real significance to anything that would have been required for it to have been reiterated. This happens again with an excerpt from Sandy saying that Brenda loved children and wanted some of her own. The first instance of this was on page 246 and the second on 309. This is all in the same chapter once again. I am not understanding what happened here as the end of the book became very disjointed and started to, I don't know what you would say, just started to get on the edge of the, wait, scratch that. I'm not understanding what happened here as the end of the book became very disjointed and started to edge on the frayed ends of sanity, to quote James Hetfield. As I read chapter 12, it became increasingly frayed in its style of writing, comprehension, and its overall point of information. Though I do wonder, once again, I have to point out, I wonder if these random repeats and stuff happen in the physical book, and if maybe this is just an error with the digital version like I had. For some reason, chapter 12 is the longest section of the entire book, being over 100 pages. It was actually grueling to read, even just silently to myself. Even worse, to read out loud, because saying it takes up even more time. Chapter 12 starts at page 165 and ends at page 316. I'm not sure why they did this, as there are more than enough times to stop somewhere and end the chapter. I believe that chapter 12 could have probably been divided into 2, maybe even 3 more chapters. And I've never read a novel of the standard 300-page length that had a whole chapter dedicated to almost half the size of the book. And I've read long books, 400-plus page books, but this choice was so peculiar to me. It was actually kind of aggravating, as the chapter has no overall theme. So we were kind of just trailing on in random ramblings and anecdotes from various people for 151 pages. And that is almost half of the book. Chapter 12 is like half the size of the book. It really is. I will be honest and say that the book is disappointing. While I know Lynette and other people were just along for the ride with Charlie, we are taken on a blind tour of a horse ranch where we can't see anything, was told things about it by other people, and the tour guide doesn't mention anything of it. We have no idea when the tour ends, where, and worst of all, we can't leave. In other words, the book has no linear structure, no sequence of events that come in a specific order that would make sense for us readers to see. In some ways, I felt like I was taken hostage. The only reason I finished this book is because the audience asked me to do it. I just wanted to get the thing done because Reflexion was often hanging over my head. It was so painful and unsatisfactory to read, at the end of it at least, that I took almost a month off of working on it because I got sick and later wanted to do something fun for once, which is why I ended up making my acid bath video. I think that the general audience realized that this book was not what they had hoped it would be, because the views on my videos trailed off rather fast, and I don't blame them one bit. It can just be so fucking boring. Thinking about the beginning of the book and how it ends, it's like the beginning explanations of historical places were completely abandoned or forgotten about, and then later replaced with excerpts and letters from various members, whether these were conjured specifically for the story or were letters sent to Lynette and Sandy in the years past. At first, the usage of these letters was cool to me. I thought it was really nice to see perspectives from other members, especially those that had never written any book, and from the ones that fell off the face of the earth. Eventually, these letters and excerpts became the tiresome norm, as they sometimes hijacked the story and disrupted its flow. Without any sort of headers or titles to explain the stories about to be shared, I would wonder why certain stories were being shared at all, especially at certain points of the story. The introduction of these excerpts should have been done much earlier in the book, as it would have made us readers used to their presence, the ideas of their context, and understand certain events being described much, much better. Eventually, the book became a dual effort between Sandra Good and Fromme, as there were parts that would be taken over completely by Sandra, and others of just them going back and forth. At first, I liked the perspective of Sandra Good, but the constant switching of the regular-faced type by Lynette, then the pages of long italicized text of Sandra was grueling. Sandra had a much more grounded perspective at times, but even her stories would go on longer than needed, at one point talking about her childhood, despite the chapter having nothing to do with childhood. It felt like the book turned into Sandra's at the end, which was sort of annoying. Why not have her inputs from the beginning? Yes, she came later to the family, but her anecdotes could have given more insight to the political conflicts at the time, and that were described at the beginning of the book. Instead, we receive a repeat excerpt about her being unsure of whether her lung being removed was necessary. Structurally, this book fell apart at the end. I have no idea what happened to it, but it was like as if no one bothered to edit it or at least proofread it. If someone read the book's final version before release, they would have seen the misspellings, the grammar errors, the confusing context to the overall text. It's actually disappointing that the book ended the way it did, as it didn't feel like a complete ending, but rather an abrupt slamming of the door, or like as if the power went out. Lynette didn't have the final word. It was yet another letter from Charlie that didn't explain much of anything. I feel disappointed in the book because it feels like it just completely ignores some of the burning questions that people have had about the group and Charlie. Of course, many people wonder why the murders took place to begin with. This was not gone over at all. No explanation. There was a little insight from Sandra, though, where Sadie and Katie had talked about the murder to her, and there wasn't much beyond that. Lynn really didn't go over it at all, and I feel like she completely ignored it. In the years since the murders, people have advocated for Charlie's innocence and stated that he should have been free since he never killed anybody. Sandra and Fromme are the two biggest supporters of Charlie, still loving him to this day. And all I just wanted to know was why. I just want to know why. Why did they believe this? What are their views? I would have loved to have read a chapter on that, honestly. I just wanted to see these sides of their brains, and yet the book never covered that. Perhaps you can say that it implies it somewhat indirectly by Charlie's want to just connect with nature. But to me, that's not enough. Why is it after 50 years and Charlie's own death that these two women still staunchly stand behind him? I just want to know why. Without even touching on the trials or even mentioning the LaBianca's murders, I really felt like certain information was just ignored. We don't need to repeat the previous books like Helter Skelter or Will You Die For Me, but considering that Lynn was really high up there, and even considered to be Charlie's golden girl by many, I would have really liked to see her perspective on the following events, especially if she had any sort of reasoning for the gatherings in front of the courthouse and like her reasoning for shaving their heads, And honestly, and no matter how off the wall or disagreeable maybe her reasonings could have been, it would have been nice to see in writing, her idea why it was the right choice to, carve an X in her forehead. I just want to know, like, what do people like her think, And considering that the title is Reflection, with an X, technically that's the Spanish version of the word, but anyway, a play on the English version of the word, it feels like clickbait, actually, that she does not go over the event that resulted in the book's namesake. To me, this does not prompt me to want to read a sequel, nor does it make any cases to advocate Charlie's freedom, justified. I have no problem, though, with reading a long book. In fact, it's all I ever seem to read anymore. Helter Skelter was about 700 pages. Diane Lake's book was a little long at 400 and some change. Chaos by Tom O'Neill is 442 pages. And Jeff Gein's book is right at 399. Many books on the Manson days are well into the chunky area. So I just don't see why they couldn't do the same thing for Reflection. If the book was 500 to 600 pages, but talked about the trials, the convictions, the loss of Spawn Ranch, the attempted assassination of Gerald Ford, and Lynn's incarceration, I would understand the length. I could even forgive some of the length to chapter 12 if this were the case. Nicholas Schreck's latest book is about 1,000 pages, from what I understand, even though I still have yet to get it in the mail. But that's another story. Anyway, Reflection by Lynette Fromme feels like a lost opportunity to explain the truth as she saw it. That it started to feel like an old person rambling just about the good old days. There were so many times that I asked myself, what does this have to do with anything? The end part made less and less sense. I had to pause, trying to understand certain parts, but even then, the material was incoherent. I just felt like, what does this anecdote have to do with anything? And what the fuck are we talking about? I know that a lot of you were disappointed in Diane's book, and I completely understand that. I understand because, God, I was too. It could have been so much more, and yet it dropped the ball. I feel this way about Reflection too. I feel like Reflection dropped the ball. At least, chapter 12 was... The chapter 12, it dropped the ball. That's what it was for me. Anyway, but I actually feel compelled to say sorry to all of you that have listened to this, as I know that many of you guys had high hopes and were really excited for this book. I was too. It was a huge disappointment. I just don't understand why the book started with a nice flow, beautiful imagery akin to clear water, to fraying at the ends like a burnt carpet. I feel discouraged in Lynn as a writer, as there is real potential in her. And with the proper co-author and editor, she could turn out something great. I have read comments that some people don't believe it was her who wrote her section of the book. To be honest, I don't really know either, but I'm just assuming it was her. And I guess at the end, whoever edited it went on vacation or something. And please, I swear I am not trying to be inflammatory or directly shit on those involved with the book. I just want to be honest with myself and my audience. I was given permission to read the book on my YouTube channel by the publisher. And for that, I am very, very grateful. I'm not using this as a way to be like, yeah, thanks, fuck you, because that's not how I feel at all. I genuinely mean that, this book could be good, with just the proper, I would say, organization, honestly. And I pretty much say the same thing about it as I said on Susan Atkins's second book, where, at least granted, when it comes down to this, where it's like, if they, like for example, Susan's second book, if she talked about her time in prison, that would have been interesting. And kind of the same thing here. If Lynette had also talked about at least the trial, that would have made this so much more interesting. Maybe would have made chapter 12 make a lot more sense, and I'm not like angry at her or anybody, I just wish this was better than it turned out to be. If someone out there doesn't like my review, just please understand that this is just an opinion piece, my own thoughts. I'm not getting paid for anything, whether I make a great review or a bad one. I'm just another fat ass that reads books. A great perspective in the book, though, was how Sandra and Lynn talked about their experiences with the others on the ranch. They were able to give body and real character to people that have otherwise always been overlooked in all of these stories about Charlie. I really loved how Mary became a real and fleshed out person, being talked about and remembered as a person, instead of just another detail or being the last of Charlie's baby mamas. To have even read a letter from Mary humanized her, which is a serious first through all of these books I've read about the Manson family in general. Susan Atkins mentions Mary a little near the end of her book, but there wasn't much body or volume to the details about her. I always wondered why the woman who had Charlie's baby was the least mentioned in all the other books. Interestingly, it was also nice to see the stories and details about Patricia Krenwinkel, though overall any stories about her seemed to be few. Reading the letters included in the book, she had a beautiful construction of words, though it appeared that she was still very misguided in life. I crave to read more about her or other people's experiences with her, though I can think of only one other book that has some sort of dialogue from her. Another interesting person to have gained information on was Cappy. This was the only book to say that she had a knack for fun facts, telling them to people unsolicited. I could be like that at times too. Granted, I wasn't too fond of the catty descriptions at times. Like, who cares if a person gained weight? Half the women were pregnant. But it was interesting, though, to see a full description of Steve Grogan and even a letter from him. It was nice to see a confirmation that, yes, his stupidity was just an act, and he was rather smart and talented. I have listened to the album The Family Jams, where he is the one singing, And I have to agree, he had a great voice. Brenda was another person that was talked about more than in any other book. While learning about her was interesting, it did feel like she was idolized because of how much the book talked about her. Near the end, it felt like she was brought up more than anyone, even Charlie, who became a distant memory in chapter 12. In fact, Brenda is one of the top 5 names mentioned in the book, Charlie being number 1 at 500 times, George Spawn 254, Ruby Pearl 98, and Brenda at 86 times. Right after Brenda was Bobby Bosley at 72 times. It was actually funny to read that Sandy never liked Susan Atkins, and Lynn wasn't the most fond of her either. It's just amazing to me that in almost every single book that has mentioned her, Susan has been recalled as being deplorable in some way. Paul's book was a little soft on her, but he was horny for everyone. Speaking of Paul, it was funny to see both Sandy and Lynn remember him as arrogant and annoying. The fact that he was really holding on to his dick and asking why they couldn't just make love during the freakout is funny to me. Both women did corroborate his book in some ways, that some events absolutely and truly happened, though he most definitely wasn't Charlie's right-hand man, as described in his book. In fact, Charlie seemed to be annoyed with Paul at times, not establishing him as a higher-up at all. I have felt that Paul's book was just another way to push Bugliosi's helter-skelter. I found it really interesting that Linda Kasabian was pregnant with Bobby's baby, as were other women, of course, but I had no idea he had a baby with her. Thinking of the alternative theories as to why the murders happened, it was brought up that it was all done to pose as copycat crimes to get Bobby out of jail. Near the end of the trials, it was brought up that all of it was Linda's idea, though, of course, the courts later disregarded this. I don't believe that it was all Linda's idea, but the possibility of trying to bail Bobby out of jail because he was Linda's second baby daddy could give a little weight to the copycat theory. I don't believe that one in its entirety, though, since there are just many other pieces of evidence to me saying otherwise. I was glad, though, that Bo made an appearance in this book, as the only other book that mentioned her was Paul's, and I still have many doubts over the things that he said. Another name I noticed was Sandra's sister, Ginny, though I suppose that this was not the same one from the compound, as Sandra's sister died in 1980, and the Ginny from the blog was called into a radio interview talking to Paul in the late 80s. There seems to have been a huge age difference, too. It was truly nice to see the book talk about George Spawn so much. None of the others ever came anywhere close to doing so as Lynn's. I really commend her for that, since her recollections of him are the only things that keeps the spirit of George alive today. Whether she sugar-coated these parts with George or not, I really liked that the group did help out this elderly man when others would not. It's actually a problem that we still see today with our elderly population. Too old to take care of themselves like they used to, they end up abused by the ones that are supposed to take care of them. It actually bothered me that Ruby Pearl would hurt George physically just to get back at him at times. Without help from the group with Charlie, Certain parts of George's life would have been terrible. The thought also struck me while reading these parts that Lynn is the only connection today that can tell us about a person who was born in the 1800s. To me, that's crazy to think. It's true, you know? And it's just a nifty way. That's how I think of things. Truthfully, I found Sandra's recollections on her childhood interesting, even if it was kind of just randomly placed in the book. I feel like her mother's instability was the main reason that Sandra felt wanting in her life. It was clear that her mom was the root of the insecurities and unhappiness that Sandra felt in her pre-Charlie life. Reading her story and understanding that many of the others, it feels like Charlie purposely latched onto people with clear traumas and insecurities. Truthfully, I thought to myself that if people just loved their children and didn't abuse them, situations like this wouldn't have happened in the first place. But I know that's a blanket statement. It's clear that the group connected over childhood traumas for the most part, which oddly makes the story appear as a coming-of-age tale. I understand the feelings of happiness, freedom, and clarity of being in your early 20s and out on your own. The camaraderie felt between a very like-minded group of friends isn't found just anywhere. And yet, this group did not become famous thanks to the power of friendship. They were involved with much more sinister things. I will end the review here, as there's always more to say, and I could truly probably go on forever, just this topic in general. Overall, it was an interesting book, though it just didn't turn out the way I had hoped. And I really wished that it would have answered more questions than books from before. While it gave some more people volume and body to their personalities, I still feel confused to this day in some ways about Charlie's character. If anything, all this book did show is that Charlie appeared as a different person to each individual. Lynn, Sandy, and Brenda saw his good side. Diane never did. She was always abused by him. Meanwhile, Paul thought that he was the second in charge, and Tex was just friends with him. I'm not sure how this book would come off to a new Manson reader. I'm not sure if a new person would even be able to finish this book, because it doesn't talk about the most popular events on why the Manson family became feared anyway. I feel like this book would be more of a collector's item for someone already deep into the rabbit hole, or just into true crime in general. For those that would rather focus on the psychology of the crimes, you might want to pass this one up, as it just doesn't talk about the crimes. But finally, I really want to thank the Peace and Hall Press for the opportunity to read this book on my channel, and I highly recommend checking out George Stimson's channel, the Helter Skelter Podcast on YouTube. This isn't just me saying this because I hope, that he won't be mad at me. I genuinely mean it. George's channel is really good, and so is his book, So, anyway, thank you for listening to me, and thank you to those who have waited so freaking long for this review. Take care.